Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo. And Charlie, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Just another day in paradise. It's lots going on. Although actually, not a whole lot of news this week. So we're just enjoying the craziness that is the industry, I guess. How about you? I see you got yourself all trimmed up. You got some hot industry dates, I guess, huh?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm headed out to a Workday Adaptive Insights event right after this. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that I cleaned up and looked pretty, of course. And yeah, it was a bit of a slow week in tech, to be honest, but kind of a big week in news in general. So we're going to try to blend that together and make sure that we provide some important guidance for the CIO office.
You mean you're not the only one that maybe got a haircut a little bit, huh?
Oh, yes, haircuts all around this week.
So, of course, the big news is Trump's tariffs. And I think certainly for us, the question, we're not going to cover this from the broad economic or political perspective. But of course, the question that we all have to ask is how does this affect enterprise IT and the enterprise tech sector? And I think it seems clear to me that there's some clarity and some ambiguity, right? So the clarity is that if the hardware players like Apple, anyone who is playing in hardware, chips being exempted at the moment, definitely taking it on the chin on this, and the stocks are reflecting that. But I think the bigger question really is the impact on enterprise software.
Mhm.
And because at first glance, right, I mean, the one thing that's interesting about these tariffs is they are exclusively focused on goods. There's no services impact at all on the tariffs. However, from an enterprise software perspective, I think that would be a misguided view for two reasons, right? One is everything that we do, software always starts with hardware, right? We have to run that software
Mhm.
on something. And even if we collectively, software companies or CIOs, are not buying that hardware any longer, if we're acquiring it as part of a cloud service or whatever, somebody's still buying that hardware and they're going to be paying for those increased costs. And that's going to get almost certainly passed on. So I think we can expect to see clearly the cost of AI, which is so heavily driven on all, for even if chips are exempted, all the other hardware components, and there's so much build out going on. Clearly, I think we should expect to see within relatively short order, unless the tariffs and go away, um, increase costs surrounding AI services just broadly. And then I think beyond that, if you're a software company or if you're an enterprise CIO, I think we're also just looking at what the overall economic impact is, right? The general consensus seems to
Mhm.
be that this is going to lead us into a recession, perhaps a global recession. And recessions are never good for anybody. I mean, ostensibly there's some opportunity for some software companies, but the weird sort of thing, despite all of the criticality of technology is still sort of seen in a lot of enterprises as a borderline nice to have, which means there is at least some degree of pullback around particularly any new spend on new technology or anything growth, which is pretty much everything we're talking about whenever there's an economic downturn. Certainly, it's going to cause some pivots and changes in how people go to market and how priorities are shifted. So, I think there's a lot of sort of warning signals on that front. I mean, you follow this all very closely. What is your take on the impact of these tariffs?
Yeah, so the good thing about being old is that the history repeats, or at least rhymes. So we saw the COVID crash in 2020. We saw the 2008 crash that was based on mortgage securities. We saw the 2000 crash based on .com evaluations, and each time this happened, we the fundamental reason for these crashes is that we thought that the economy was going to slow down and purchasing was going to slow down, and this always has meant, from an IT perspective, very fundamentally, that there's going to be a reduction in budget, but that overall reduction in budget will always be balanced, right? It's not that we're going to see across the board evenly cut budgets. We are probably going to continue to see AI get investment, but that dollar is not going to go as far as it was intended to go from an AI investment perspective. You're still going to have that whatever 5%, 10% increase, but it's just you're just not going to be able to get quite as much on the one hand. And on the other hand, we've seen that to pay for this stuff, you're going to probably look at some short-term audits and optimization opportunities to look at all your usage, look at all your licenses, dig deep into the little details, and start finding that extra slack that you might have had in place to be able to handle new employees or to be handle new functionalities, and simply pour that money somewhere else. So this is a reallocation moment for your IT portfolio. So not just your stock portfolio, but your IT portfolio as well. This is a good time to dig and talk to your expense management people, your FinOps people, your budget people, your planning people, and really get a good idea of where you can rob Peter to pay Paul, because you can't just stop working, but you are going to have to change where the money comes from and where the money's going.
And I do think there could be good opportunity for the FinOps plays, and we have a little bit of that news today and a few other areas. There's always this sort of push towards belt tightening and creating visibility into spend, things that frankly should always be happening that organizations sometimes struggle with. The thing I think that is the wild card here, though, is that generally when these sort of downturns or threatened downturns are caused by normal market forces, there's a degree of certainty. I mean, there may still be some ambiguity in that. How big is it going to be? How, are we going to see a correction? Are we going to see a soft landing? Any of those sorts of things. But in this case, the volatility factor is so off the charts, and the unpredictability factor, because it's driven so much by the Trump administration's policies, and those could change on a whim, that I think one of the things that we are seeing, and this is a little bit unique, is a whole lot of wait and see. So I think it's going to actually portend a very challenging quarter for tech companies, because we're going to see across the board everyone just sort of stop in their tracks to see if they can figure out which way this is going. The good news is I don't think that means we're going to see like massive layoffs or anything in the short term, because everyone's going to be in this sort of holding pattern. But I also think we're going to see spending just pause in many cases. Which, if you're trying to bring anything new to market, that could be a challenge. I think if you're a CIO, to your point, if these tariffs do stick, you're probably, what was an incremental increase in budget is probably going to do nothing but simply keep pace if you're lucky. So, I think there's a lot of challenges, and it's going to be an interesting period over the next at least quarter, maybe several quarters, while this all gets sorted out.
Yeah, I think it's, frankly, though, I always think about this a little bit entrepreneurially, and I think it's a massive opportunity, because all your competitors are going to stop doing things for the next quarter because they're going to be scared of what happens next. If you are able to run your business or your department more on a cash flow basis, and you have a good idea of what you want to do for the next couple of years, I honestly think this is a great opportunity to be able to move forward while everybody else is too busy thinking about what their stock price is.
There was a report on this, I think, like maybe it was a year ago, where it talked about the fact that and we'll see if this does turn out to be a significant downturn, but during significant downturns is often when we see the birth of some of these large companies, because startups are often unencumbered by some of the things that will hold back their larger counterparts during a downturn, and so therefore they can operate a little bit more freely and take advantage of those opportunities. So yeah, we'll see if that transpires.
Yeah.
All right. Well, in other industry news, Llama, or Meta, introduced, this one threw me, what they're calling the Llama herd, which is nothing but their term, I guess, because they're playing off llama maybe, but a family of models. So that the herd part is just a whatever, but it is an interesting set of models, and they of course are claiming that they outperform everybody. That seems to be you cannot bring a new model to market without saying you outperform everybody. But it does seem interesting. I think they are natively multimodal. They are I think a very interesting I think we're starting to see this approach now where they are distillation based models. So they're building a big giant. So their big one is called Behemoth. It's a 288 billion parameter model that they're then using to distill smaller models out of. And this is apparently, actually didn't know this, that this is their first mixture of experts model approach. And so seeing really good performance, although questionable, as we'll talk about in a second. But I mean, what was your take? I mean, I always sort of like get about talking about new models because it's like, okay, is this really noteworthy and newsworthy anymore? But what was your take on this? Anything that jumped
Yeah,
out at you?
I feel like the last month has been exciting to look at these foundation models, just because there's been so much interesting stuff coming out with between Claude 3.7 Sonnet, the most recent Google Gemini models, using these mixture of experts offerings, having a more extended chain of thought, having larger windows that can take in a lot of information at once, although you don't necessarily want to be shoving a new database in every single time you want to do a new prompt. So, I think there's mixed value to that increased window size. But be that as it may, so Meta has put its latest models into the ring, and as you say, Charlie, this has always been important. This is important because Meta has been leading the way from an open source AI perspective, at least in the United States, and it's hard to avoid Meta being an option here. I have not heard so far from my developer friends that Meta has been extremely impressive with its new set of models, but that's not necessarily the ultimate measure of success for Meta.
Well, I do think what's interesting, I think there's two things to your point, right? Meta is in an interesting space in that I don't know that anybody, perhaps including them, really understands what their end game is. Like, I think we all understand what the end game is for OpenAI, for Anthropic, for Microsoft. We get where they're going, and they're all taking slightly different strategies on how they get there. Meta doesn't really have a monetization model. It seems like their strategy has been that they need to be a player, that this is the future, but they don't really know how it fits in yet. They know that it will eventually play a role in their core products. And so they wanted to have a seat at the table. That part I think they're succeeding in. I do think, and I don't know if this is by design or not, I do think that they are having this interesting um, an interesting aspect of it is developing is that they're really the only open source model from a major player that people sort of have trust in. And so therefore we're seeing like NVIDIA use them. I've talked to a lot of enterprises that are at least experimenting with, can we use Llama as our backend, if with using it as a foundation within Bedrock or using it as a foundation within um, uh, the wow, it just escaped me. The snowflakes, right?
Mhm.
Any of these kind of models where it's like using this as foundation because it is in fact open source and it's open weight. And so I think that they're maybe by de facto, like I said, I don't know if it's intentional, but they're sort of becoming that. If you're trying to do this on your own, you don't want to get subject to having to pay for it. That's where you're at least starting. And so that makes it really interesting. And so the thing I alluded to, so this is going to play into an IBM announcement here in a second, but the thing that I alluded to is the everyone goes on about how they have to outperform, and so people called into question at least some of the meta benchmarks that they published with this release. And I looked at this and I shrugged because it's like, you know, I get why the benchmarks are important. I get mostly because it's so hard to evaluate these models. And the issue here is that apparently Meta tuned one of their models for a specific benchmark, which was sort of disingenuous.
Mhm.
But I get here, I land here and I go, well, if this is where it's really going, then does any of that really matter? Am I going to choose to pay millions of dollars using the OpenAI API versus using the meta model because it outperforms by a couple points on some abstract model? Probably not. So, I mean, that was my take, but I don't know. Do you see anything bigger in it?
I think the only other thing that I could add is I think back to a few months ago when Claire Shih, formerly at Salesforce, took over at Meta as the head of business AI. So obviously she has enterprise cred, And I think the part of the strategy here is to simply get more AI out to as many people as possible. But I agree that it's hard to see what the long-term monetization strategy is here, because Meta slash Facebook has traditionally done not a great job of providing business level tech. They tried to do Facebook for business. They have tried to do a variety of different data and analytic services, and anything that's not related to ads has basically sunk. We didn't see, say, Oculus or their VR capabilities become the default enterprise extended reality solution, despite having spent billions and billions of dollars on this. So I think that's still the real question of how they can turn this into a business. How, because in theory, you would think that these meta models are eventually going to turn into some sort of Red Hat like business if they're serious about this.
Well, I'm not convinced that they have enterprise aspirations, but then that
Right.
leads to the question of like, then what's the point of these
Mm-hmm.
models? I mean, and there's plenty of like, I'm not convinced that OpenAI truly has a good enterprise strategy either. I think they're going much more the consumer, maybe the developer route of it. But I still, I think that there's still this open question mark. It's like, how does this benefit Meta's other businesses if that's the ultimate intent? And I don't know if there's an answer, but regardless, I do think I, all of that aside, I actually think they're in a pretty good position in part, at least if to the extent that the goal is market share and mind share, because we're seeing the shift. So one of the other announcements or news that came out is that IBM has introduced a new mainframe. Gotta love this, right? The Z17. And how many articles have we written about the mainframe being dead? And I've been a proponent of the fact that mainframe isn't dead and won't be dead for a very long time, for a while. Um, and we talked a little bit over the last couple of years about, could this be a home for AI? Well, I think what's interesting is that this is, first of all, IBM is bringing this market specifically targeting it as a platform for AI workloads. And I think it's going to find in some quarters anyway, a welcome, uh, a welcome reception here, because I think we're seeing a move towards, and this is broader, right? Goes back to the cloud workload repatriation question, right? Is that anything running in the cloud is expensive or can be expensive if it's highly transactional, and so you have to ensure that there's enough use case here for the elasticity and all of those needs. And when there's not, it makes sense to run this on owned assets, right? And so that was part of the use case behind why the mainframe wasn't going to die anyway, because so many of these workloads were in fact very non-elastic. They were very static. They've been running the same way for 20 years, and we didn't need, and we could drive flexibility around the edges. And what I think is interesting is I think for a lot of these AI workloads, we're going to find something very similar in some cases. And so there's a case. Now, the question is, if you're doing that and you're trying to run this in-house, well, what are you going to run? Well, this is where I think Meta has a leg up, because it makes total sense. Let me go ahead and run an open source LLM that I can run on my own mainframe, and suddenly it opens a store. And I think we're going to see more and more of that sort of play out. So I think it's an interesting news, not surprising. And I think it portends this sort of bifurcation that we're seeing, that I think we'll continue to see across sort of all dimensions of this as enterprises try to figure out the right way. And I will stand by something I've been saying for probably close to 10 years now, that this is the age of hybrid IT. We're never going to see everything in the cloud. It's going to be this balance, and it's all about the workload. And I think this is just more proof of that fact.
Yeah, and at the most fundamental level, models and make it easier to automate transactions. So it makes all that much more important to support highly efficient transactions at scale. And obviously, that is what the mainframe is fantastic at. It is a box, you put it out there, and it will manage at parallel. Massively parallel, ease of transaction work flow through, and that's exactly what you're going to need in an AI world. And I think one of the other things that got my attention here is that at the same time, IBM also announced the acquisition of a data consultancy firm, Hakoda, that will, I'm sure, be helpful in bringing together the mainframe, your data warehouse, and your AI strategy. All of that, the data modernization story has become more important for IT, and Mainframe is just going to be part of that hybrid story going forward. We can finally stop saying that on-prem is dead, cloud is everything, or vice versa. Cloud is overrated, everything's going to come back on-prem. That we know that we have a spectrum, and there is just a spectrum of capabilities that you need based on what is most appropriate for the workload.
Yeah, it's interesting you say it, because I think if I look at the major trend lines over the last, say, 10 years or so, what we have big data, we have cloud, we have digital transformation, we have modernization, and now we have AI. And it's tempting to look at these as cyclical. It's tempting to look at them as sequential, like we went through one and that one sort of died off and now went onto the other. But as we'll keep talking about here through the rest of the show, none of them have gone away. None of them are quote unquote done. And I would argue, I cut my teeth on digital transformation. That's where I sort of have made my name for the last 10, 15 years. I would argue it's all of this is just, as you said, that spectrum of digital transformation. That's all the exact same story. That we exited the era of the sort of monolithic approach to technology, and we've now been on this journey that I don't even know if AI is the culmination of it or not. It might be, but it's this journey through this spectrum of transformation of how do we modernize the enterprise technology stack and really the technology philosophy, how we leverage and deploy technology. And it's sort of like every step becomes both more illuminating and more complex. And so it gets tougher. And so I think that's what we're really seeing through this. And so to me, these are all part of the same story, which is why I love talking about them. Okay, so we have three stories here that are sort of like a drive-by. None of them are really big in and of themselves, and they aren't really even connected. But I'm going to tee them all up, and then we can sort of talk through them quickly. But there are three pieces of news that I think all speak to different aspects of this transformational journey that we just talked about. So I'll tee them up for you, and then you can opine away. So the first is Zoom. And the big question is so they made an announcement about introducing what they're calling Zoom tasks. And this is part of their agentic AI push. And I would argue part of their push to find renewed relevance after the end of the pandemic, where that being Zoom was enough. And now they're effectively trying to compete with Microsoft Teams as a collaboration platform. And so this is part of that. And the question is it enough? Can they really compete there? Is that, where does that play out? Complete other end of the spectrum, but talking about operationalization, CloudBolt made an acquisition of a company called StormForge. And this is really going to the FinOps story you're talking about. It's really two parts of the things we talk about. FinOps, but it's FinOps specific to this idea of Kubernetes and taming the beast. And Kubernetes is something that was one of the hot topics just a few years ago. And we haven't talked a whole lot about it now, but I think this is more a function of this of what you're talking, the spectrum that you're talking about. It's reaching this point of operationalization, and how do you deal with it? And then the other complete end of the spectrum is we have Solo.io, which has announced their new MCP gateways. And what's interesting here is we talked last week about MCP breaking onto the scene and getting all this attention, and we're in the massive early hype stage around it. And to me, the big takeaway from the Solo.io announcement is how much is left to be done to make any of this make sense. So I sort of look at this, and I look at these three stories as this kind of broad spectrum, right? You've got this Zoom sort of in the middle, trying to figure out how to compete in this rapidly changing world, but very in the trenches. This is production stuff. You have the CloudBolt and Kubernetes, which is all about operationalization, deep into the weeds of this, and then brand new stuff, asking the question, how do we start operationalizing these new ideas? So, I mean, I just think it's a kind of an interesting window into it. So any of this strike to you, jump out at you, or what's your take on any of this?
Gosh, you're starting with Zoom. I feel like Zoom is in a difficult place right now, not because it's not a core tool at this point, but because it's not sure how to take its next step. When I think of Zoom, fundamentally, it's a meeting solution first, but the translating meetings into productivity often means having some idea of how to translate the meeting into a set of actions, aligning to a project plan, and being able to set up a portfolio of actions going forward, which is really more towards activity automation and perhaps an agentic approach to being able to kick off some new capabilities and actions. And instead, Zoom feels like they're trying to go more towards docs and some traditional applications where they are fighting against productivity apps that are already extremely well established. Like taking on Office is always a really, really difficult thing to do because you've got Office, you've got Google Docs and apps, and all of those huge competitors that are already very ingrained into a business.
Yeah, I think Zoom, I agree with you. I think Zoom is in a very difficult spot now because they were brilliant at figuring out how to make the online meeting process, right? Remember when they came of age, they were in the age of WebEx and Meetup and what was I forgot, I actually forgot the other one. There was another big one. Before Teams. And it was just a cleaner solution. It worked. It was easy, right? And it solved a very specific sort of thing. And the pandemic hit and it exploded. But then Teams sort of recognized, or Microsoft sort of recognized, that a meeting was just one part of a continuum
Mm-hmm.
of collaboration and productivity that started with an application and sharing that application and working on it together and then messaging people about it. And a meeting was just a natural extension of that. And for most organizations that spent a lot of their time internally focused, it made sense. And I hated Teams, right? I really did. But having taken this job where I'm now on the inside, it makes so much more sense, right? Because it's just this integrated thing. And so that's what Zoom is fighting against, right? That's a huge battle to climb. And so they had a choice, and I guess time will tell if they made the right one. Do they go after a full frontal assault and basically say, well, we have to therefore replicate the same thing, which is the choice they made, right? So they're trying to replicate effectively that entire Teams Office ecosystem. Or did they try to take and make a meeting apart and anchor to some other view of the world? And I'm not even sure what that would have been, but that was their choice. They would have had to anchor it to another perspective, another ethos that would have then won out and made the meeting a part of something different.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't. And so I think it's an interesting choice. But I think I personally would not want to be competing with Microsoft. So I think they're in a tough spot. But we'll see how this goes. We'll see. I mean, I think the key for them will be to leverage their ability to potentially move more quickly because they are a little bit smaller, but we'll see. Let's talk about FinOps. I'm curious the Kubernetes piece. I found it fascinating, just because Kubernetes is one of those things that it's very technical and but from a FinOps perspective in particular, there's a huge play.
Yeah, so this is interesting to me on multiple accounts. First of all, StormForge has been this originally named Carbon Relay. It's been this Kubernetes orchestration solution, and it's fantastic at what it does. When we think about Kubernetes, it's a great way to be able to abstract workloads across different infrastructure as needed to support the workload, but it's very ephemeral and it's hard to keep track of. So StormForge has been a great solution to be able to keep track of what is happening through Kubernetes and to be able to optimize workflows and workloads through Kubernetes. Really good. The challenge is that they raised $63 million back in 2020 to be this Kubernetes optimization solution back when Kubernetes was the hottest thing in tech, or at least one of the hottest things in tech. Kubernetes was then what AI is now in terms of being a buzzword. And everybody just couldn't stop saying K8s, K8s or Kubernetes, and how this was going to be the future of all infrastructure. And it didn't quite work out that way. Kubernetes is obviously important, but it is not the end all be all of IT as it kind of felt 5 years ago. At the same time, this separate company, CloudBolt, comes in. They have been a FinOps solution, also raised a big amount of money in 2020. Also from the same company that funded StormForge. Insight Partners was the lead investor in both companies. So Insight Partners sees both of these companies going their parallel paths in supporting workloads at scale, StormForge from the more technical side, CloudBolt from the more financial side, and says these things are coming together. And really, the challenge is about supporting abstract hybrid cloud environments from both the financial and an operational perspective. Let's bring these together so we have greater visibility to what is happening at cloud as a whole, and to be able to handle both the minute changes that are happening at a very rapid basis based on Kubernetes for StormForge, and then being able to bring that back to operational and financial visibility in CloudBolt so that you have a better idea of what is happening at a big picture in the cloud world. So I think this is a great move from that big picture perspective in being able to manage the cloud and understand what's going on.
Yeah, I think we're going to see more and more of this sort of stuff as we are looking at I can never say this word, operationalization, and just the need to simplify. The need to bring everything together. I think the challenge for Kubernetes has always been the complexity that it brought, because even though on the one hand it's designed to drive flexibility and vis-a-vis that simplicity on one level, right? It also just the ephemerality of it makes it very difficult to manage, and it's particularly from a cost standpoint, and that's what they're trying to address here. And I think that we're going to see that. We're going to see that the world, and this is why I'm a huge fan of FinOps in general right now. And I think, and going all the way back to where we started the conversation with tariffs, it's going to drive this home even more. It's like we have to merge FinOps and the operational aspects of it together. We have to be looking at everything holistically at all times. And I think that's what part of this is. So I know we're going to run out of time, so we can talk about the MCP thing later. I think it's just, but to me, the MCP story with Solo IO is just the same thing. It's like, okay, we have this great idea, but now people are starting to come out of the woodwork and talk about how do you actually make it a reality. And that's what that one's about. I think it's interesting. But that also leads to sort of the next conversation, and we'll end on these last two stories. And that is, how do enterprises actually, when it comes to AI, operationalize? How do they actually make all of this stuff work in practice? And where does this sort of land on the spectrum? And so you brought up a really interesting article that on the surface has nothing to do with enterprise IT, in that it is WPP, which is would you call them an advertising firm or
Yes,
a broader
an ad
marketing
agency.
firm?
Yeah.
They acquire a company called Infosum. I'll let you cue this up, and then I'll tell you why I think this is actually relevant. So go and cue this up.
Yeah, so WPP, which is one of the big ad agencies in the world, they do all of this, media and PR related work, and they purchased a company called Infosum, which has been a data collaboration platform, best known for being able to support collaboration on data without requiring sharing. So you can have more of a zero trust environment and still be able to have multiple parties work with data. And obviously, this seems very unrelated at first glance, because we're not used to thinking of ad agencies purchasing something that is such a deeply data governance and data security type of product.
But the reason, and so I think there's two things that speak to this and why this is in fact relevant, and if you're a CIO, why you should be sort of paying attention to this. The first is that it speaks to the absolute criticality of data to everything. We've talked about that repeatedly on this show, about data is the lifeblood, right? That there's really, when it comes to AI and really digital transformations, we talked about, it's all part of the same spectrum. Really, there's two things that sit at the center of everything, and that's your data and your workflows, right? You got to get those two down. You need to understand how they fit together. And so these data pipelines, what is interesting here, I think the other interesting aspect is we talked a little bit earlier about this move towards AI applications. And I just so we're clear, I do not think this is mutually exclusive. I think the average enterprise is going to be deploying across this entire spectrum, building completely bespoke solutions using agentic AI frameworks and AI frameworks, and then buying AI apps. And while this ostensibly doesn't have anything directly to do with AI per se, it does, because it's the same concept, right? That I cannot, so the whole reason that they're making this acquisition is to help organizations harvest their first party data to make better decisions and to drive marketing intelligence, which means it's of course leveraging both the data pipelines as well as an AI layer to take advantage of that. And what this is sort of speaking to is that the average organization, particularly when it comes to like things like ad buys, doesn't have enough visibility themselves. They have the data, but they don't necessarily have the expertise to operationalize that data. And rather than just having to try to go and say, well, we can't help you unless you build that out, they basically are coming to say, we can do it for you. We've got the data capacity, the technical capacity to actually solve this problem for you. And I think we're going to see more and more of these types of solutions across the spectrum, where organizations are bringing together, they're building out capabilities around data and AI to solve specific problems. And that will, whether that gets manifest as an AI application or something else, it's going to be part of the solution. And I think for a CIO, that means you're going to have to get very, very careful and very selective about where you make those investments. What are you buying? Where does it make sense for you to buy? Where do you invest in building, and where do you sit on that spectrum? And I think this is just a fascinating example of how that's going to play out.
Yeah, there's definitely pressure to maintain and protect the crown jewels of your first party data at this point. But there's the AI pressure to use other data as much as possible. So this is a smart, I think, offensive move on WPP's part to recognize this is a client issue, and we're just going to go and buy that primary technology and make it a core part of our offering going forward.
And I think it's really interesting because I don't want to say it speaks to the weakness in the approach that like a Salesforce and Agentforce is taking, but I think it speaks to the water's edge of that approach, meaning that if you go hear the Salesforce pitch, and it's not just them, right? Almost anyone that is sort of pitching this framework, the sort of messages, you can do anything you want, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on the surface, that's a true statement. The challenge is that understanding the intricacies of the workloads, the data pipelines, all that's really difficult to do, and that means you're shifting. You have to take on all of that capacity internally as an enterprise IT organization or as an enterprise organization, and that doesn't necessarily make sense, right? It when you have these targeted specific use cases, it makes a lot of sense to let somebody who has expertise in those deliver them, and then you focus your resources other places, which leads to the last story for the day. And this is from CIO Dive, one of our favorites. And I don't actually remember which one of us found this one, but it basically talks about enterprises having high ROI hopes for agentic AI. And I chuckled at it because I mean, this is coming from a PagerDuty study or survey. Look, I'm a huge proponent of agentic AI. I'm very bullish on it. Obviously, Symphony AI is rolling out an agentic AI platform, right? So I'm all in with this. But basically, this article goes through and talks about how, in a nutshell, CIOs kind of got burned. They couldn't really deliver ROI out of generative AI, but agentic AI is going to be different. It was sort of like, okay, hope springs eternal. And look, I think there's a ton of value, a ton of opportunity, and I think they're right to be optimistic about it. But what the article and the study didn't really dive into is the why, right? What makes this different? Why is it going to be different? And all these things we just finished talking about really throughout this entire show play into that. It's like, if you're going to drive value out of agentic AI, you've got to be delivering across the spectrum. You've got to get the building blocks right. You've got to be focusing on all this. You can't buy into the hype that you just go and it magically happens. And that's my concern when I was reading sort of through this, is it's just sort of, new hype for another day.
Yeah, one of the tactical survey issues that I had here is that it talks about how 62% of survey respondents anticipate triple digit ROI, and that they expect that there's going to be an average ROI of 152%. I think this is a real mistake in how to look at the survey results, because what we should really be expecting from agentic AI is that there's probably these bimodal results. You've got your companies looking at double-digit ROI because they are trying to automate some specific process and get some basic productivity. And then we've got the triple-digit ROI use cases where we're actually trying to change the way that we work. That is the real split happening here. And simply averaging all of this and getting to a mushy middle of 150% when we're really talking about 30% ROI versus 500% ROI, I think that's a big mistake. And it shows what can happen when you look at survey data and you simply put everything together rather than looking at the groups of results that are coming into place. I think it's very important to understand that these are specific use cases that we're looking at for agentic AI. The more important thing here is not whether the number is 110% or 150%, but to understand how is agentic AI going to fundamentally transform aspects of your business that are going to scale to hundreds of workers and actually provide additional value and allow for additional discussion and improve these meetings and improve these outcomes at the end of the day. That's what we need to be getting to here. What percentage of companies are going to improve outcomes, not what is the number.
Well, what I think is fascinating about this, and I completely agree with you, we have this weird fascination around ROI, and I think when it comes to things like agentic AI, any
And
form
I
of
love ROI.
transformation.
I do ROI case studies. Like I do this all the time. It's not that I don't like the number, but the number is a result of what you're trying to do. It's not a standalone thing.
And then the number can be misleading because to your point, it can be either too narrowly or too broadly focused. So, one of the things that we talk about with our solution is that when someone asks me about ROI, I talk about it in 3 dimensions, right? The first is I have the ROI of deflection. That's the easiest to quantify. We can calculate it. It has nothing to do with anything other than the fact that this is how you're currently operating. And we're going to make that more efficient. And then you have the sort of second level of ROI, which is really about this idea of productivity transformation, right? How do we start changing the way people work? And what does that unleash? And this is much fuzzier. It's really harder, but it's also where, where when I'm talking about an efficiency driven ROI, I've got a cap. There's only so much efficiency. If I've got $100 in cost, I can never save more than $100. But when I'm driving productivity above the value, right? If I'm giving a salesperson 3 more hours a week to work, and they close $10 more million worth of deals in that, guess what? That becomes an astronomical ROI. How much of it's attributable? Well, hard. It's a fuzzy number. And then I have even beyond that, I have this fundamental transformation where I'm actually changing the way we work altogether. And maybe that is impacting my ability to deliver an experience to employee in our case. Or maybe if you're transforming the way you do shelf optimization or supply chains or whatever, and you create a competitive edge that literally nobody else is is able to do in the market, that's literally not even measurable, at least not in any conventional way until you get to that result. And so you have, it's when you talk about ROI, you've got to be thinking about what is that transformational spectrum. And in many cases, the best solutions are going to do it across all 3. And to your point, try to homogenize that into some simple number doesn't make any sense. And this is, but that's sort of what we've created in this business climate. So I look at these studies and I always chuckle, and I get why they exist and I get why they're important. And I always go, yeah, but if you get hung up on that, you miss the real point. So I hope you're excited. If you're a CIO, I hope you are in fact excited about agentic AI. I do believe it's transformative. I do believe that if you take the right approach, you can create tremendous amount of value and advantage. And you need to make sure you're doing it from the right perspective and looking at it the right way if you wanted to get there. So yeah.
Yeah, so normally we end on a funny note, but this time around, a very practical note, looking at that zero-sum total cost of ownership productivity angle as a starting point, moving to looking at revenue top line growth as perhaps an intermediate ROI, and then looking at business transformation and business expansion as a long-term strategic return on investment. Those are important steps to be taking. It's an important spectrum to be looking at, and it needs to be part of your, call it 3 to 5 year timeline for AI, which may feel extremely intimidating from a technology perspective, but the reality is that AI is a long-term investment and not simply something you put into place in the here and now because it's a trendy term.
And to say it better.
Yeah, and on that note, thank you so much for joining us again for another This Week in Enterprise Tech. If you enjoyed this, please like, please subscribe, please comment, and please let us know what you want us to take on for next week. Thanks so much for joining us yet again. See you next week.